This is Channel 4 with the start of a brand new series of dispatches.
The police say he's the most dangerous man in Britain. Lennie Smith is a convicted paedophile and a suspected child killer. Most people think he's safely behind bars, but within 18 months, he could be back on the streets. Tonight, Dispatches shows how justice fails to keep our children safe.
Behind the walls of Nottingham Prison is a special unit for sex offenders, a halfway house back into society once they've served their sentences. The men inside are technically free. Two of them are members of Britain's most notorious paedophile gang, a gang that killed young boys. One is Robert Oliver. He's just served 8 years for the manslaughter of a child. The other is Lennie Smith. He was the gang's mastermind. Most people had assumed that Smith would spend the rest of his life behind bars, if only for his own safety. But Lennie Smith is in the unit only of his own free will. And our information is that although he's been able to talk to other paedophiles on the telephone, he's bored, he's frustrated, and he's desperate to leave. For the next 18 months at least, if he moves, he'll need permission. But after that, Lennie Smith will be free to come and go as he pleases.
Lennie Smith is a man who has been involved in the death and horrific abuse of young boys. If he's released from prison, he will do it again, which makes him, in my view, the most dangerous man in England.
9, 10, 11. Is it like anything over 12 years old?
Someone he could dominate.
So he could dominate, yes. To hurt them. He told me he's hurt so many boys that he gets a thrill of telling people about the pain and hurt that he's given. So that is Lennie all over.
Lennie used to take him to the flat and do what he had to do to Nicky. He threatened Nicky to say that if Nicky had ever said anything, that he'd kill his little sister. He'd hurt me and his father. He made Nicky do sexual acts on him that you wouldn't expect a 6-year-old kid to do.
Like many paedophiles, Lennie Smith too had been abused as a child in care. Anger and sexual obsession began to make him what he is today, a man whose pleasure can turn to rage, where sex and violence become lethally confused. In the mid-1970s, Smith ran away to London and began renting his body to men. Then he saw that there was a better living to be made by procuring boys for others. He was a natural. He'd discovered his true vocation. But he had his own needs, and they were strong and dangerous. One young lover, he was 17 at the time, was mesmerized by his charm, but terrified by his demands.
It was 6 times straight after the other. There was no like half an hour break or an hour break, it was 6 times. And you just, after 4, you're like, I've had enough. And you're thinking, oh, here we go. And it was 6 times every time. It wasn't just like once or twice, it was 6 times every time.
Smith had many ways of attracting the boys. He performed in drag shows at the Royal Oak, a gay venue in Hackney, East London. He could convince children to trust someone who seemed so clearly feminine.
His make-up talents were unbelievable. He could be a female, he could be an older male. He could put makeup on like no other makeup artist can. Like an actor. That's what he was. He was an actor.
The more attractive he made himself, the more successful he became in attracting children, and the more dangerous. Smith had served several short spells in prison, and in 1987 he was back again for abusing a 13-year-old boy. He shared the secrets of his success with other sex offenders on the wing.
What other ways did he use? Because they must have realised that he wasn't a woman.
Pay them, threaten them, buy them clothes and things like that, because he was pretty good like that to them.
Generous to them.
Very generous. Until if a boy refused, then he wasn't generous. He turned the other side of the coin.
Smith left little to chance. He'd often spike his victims' drinks with drugs like temazepam or diazepam, a muscle relaxant and antidepressant, which made the boys less resistant. Smith had become expert in the means to guarantee his own pleasure. One of his regular hunting grounds was an East London public lavatory, where Smith first met Sidney Cooke, another violent paedophile, and Leslie Bailey, a sexual inadequate who hung around Cooke in the hope of getting a share of his boys. But the gang's mastermind was to be Lennie Smith. Their young targets would often gather at a nearby cafe, then run by another of his former lovers.
Lennie was definitely the talent spy. It wasn't any young boy. It had to be a certain age. We had quite a few coming to the cafe, so there was in and out like yo-yos. And Cooke was, being an old man, would easily get on with young boys. They fell into his trap, really. Because he's an old man, they wouldn't take much notice of him.
He was acting for Lennie.
He was acting for Lennie, yeah. If he had sex with them, and they did everything he wanted, then that sex would continue. But once they started answering back, then that's when the evil side of himself would come out. The werewolf character he was.
Cooke and Smith cruised the country to wherever boys would gather: sweet shops, playgrounds, fun fairs, amusement arcades. Cooke was the practical one. He supplied the car, he supplied the flats to bring the children back to. Smith was seductive, attractive. He supplied the charm. Together they made a formidable predatory partnership.
Later, in prison, Lennie Smith and Sidney Cooke boasted about how many children they'd abducted.
Did they talk about any other boys?
Yes.
Boys they'd picked up?
Yes.
Boys they'd abused?
Yes.
Boys they'd killed?
Yes.
They gave details about that?
Oh, yes.
How many boys?
About 5 or 6.
Many of the boys were taken to the sordid headquarters of Lennie Smith's gang on the then notorious Kingsmead estate in Hackney, East London.
In the 1980s, it was one of Britain's most crime-ridden estates. It was a dumping ground for misfits, failures, the drugged, the drunk, and the delinquent. You knew you'd hit rock bottom once you reached the Kingsmead.
Here, Smith and Cooke regularly organised parties, sex orgies, some in a flat on the 4th floor of Ashmead House. Boys were enticed, abducted, invited, paid. They were the party entertainment. As many as 10 men would abuse one child. Sometimes the boys were passed on to other paedophiles, some even killed. Smith later boasted about the details to numerous cellmates. The stories they repeated to the police were remarkably consistent.
But it used to make me feel sick.
And he did it because it made him feel good.
It made him because he felt good.
And you believed him? I mean, you think he was talking about things he had done?
I had to blame him because the others were telling me exactly the same thing.
Other members of the gang?
Other members of the gang.
In 1985, the bodies of 2 boys were found buried in shallow graves just outside London. One of them, that of 14-year-old runaway Jason Swift. Post-mortems revealed that both had been identically drugged, repeatedly sexually assaulted, and strangled. One of the longest and most intensive manhunts in British history led the police to the Kingsmead estate. 2 of Smith's gang broke down and told of the night Jason Swift was killed. Lennie Smith was also arrested and charged, but unlike the rest of the gang, he denied ever knowing Jason, and the magistrate at the committal hearing dismissed the case against him. On the 15th of May 1989, at No. 1 Court in the Old Bailey, Sidney Cooke, Stephen Barrell, Robert Oliver and Leslie Bailey were found guilty of the manslaughter of Jason Swift. Police believed the paedophile ring had been broken, though some sex offender experts are reluctant to describe the gang in those terms.
Paedophile is the wrong name for these men. They are sadistic offenders who have killed children. These men also were having sex with each other. I mean, a fixated paedophile would often find homosexuality as disgusting as heterosexuality. These people were into sex, and they didn't appear to care how and who they had sex with.
Cooke, Oliver, Barrell and Bailey were behind bars for the manslaughter of Jason Swift. But gang leader Lennie Smith was to face no charges. Smith has always had the knack of winning people's confidence and trust. On the Kingsmead, one of his targets had been a 6-year-old child, a child he offered to babysit, a child that he repeatedly raped.
I was ill and I was taken into hospital. And Lennie volunteered to look after Nicky, like after school, cook him dinner, take him to school, bring him home. And until my husband got home from work, you know, there used to be a meal on the table. And then he used to bring Nicky out to the hospital to see me and things like that.
So as far as you're concerned, I mean, he was being a terrific help.
Well, he was, he was like as if he was one of the family. Like having another brother helping out, like family do.
And you trusted him completely?
Oh yeah, trusted him completely. Yeah, completely. I mean, we knew that, like, being gay, we always used to say to Nicky, if anything goes wrong, you've got to tell us. And he said, no, nothing's wrong. Nothing's wrong. And that was it. I mean, you take your kid's word, don't you? But, no, not Nick.
Lennie Smith made Nicky keep their terrible secret for years by telling the boy he would kill his sister if he breathed a word to anyone. Only years later, when Nicky was sent away to boarding school, did he feel secure enough to share his shame.
Also, just one day out of the blue, we get a phone call to say that we've got to go up to the school because Nicky had told the headmaster that Lennie had abused him.
So when Nicky was at the boarding school, he was safe enough, he felt safe enough.
He felt safe, yeah.
In order to be able to tell the headmaster that these things had been happening.
Yeah.
If you can bear to, what things did he say had happened?
That Lennie used to touch him. He used to have to get on his knees.
In 1992, Smith was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the serious sexual abuse of Nicky. But prison only seemed to sharpen Smith's compulsion to tell cellmates about the children he had known and used. During an earlier sentence, he had talked in graphic detail about the death of Jason Swift.
What he said was, they took him back to Sidney Cooke's place and they set up an orgy. So they doped Jason up.
Why did they have to dope Jason?
Well, Jason was getting a bit nosy for his own good. What was happening is, they were having younger boys in, and Jason was seeing this.
And Jason disapproved of them having younger boys?
Yes. It caused a big argument between Sidney Cooke and Lennie.
So to get Jason available for this orgy, they drugged him.
They drugged him. They doped him so badly, right, by the time they finished having this orgy, I mean, this wasn't them too, it was other people in the gang who were having him afterwards, right, and by the time they finished with him, he was already dead.
Dispatches has learnt that altogether the police interviewed 6 cellmates of Smith who had been treated to his confessions, many of them specifically about Jason Swift. The volume and consistency of their evidence seemed overwhelming. The police sent a new report to the Crown Prosecution Service, yet the CPS decided not to proceed.
They didn't feel that there was sufficient evidence. They were concerned that a lot of the witnesses were people not of good character. They're people that had been abusers of children, rapists, people who one wouldn't normally expect to give evidence. But a lot of these people have values, different to yours and mine, but they have values, and there are certain things that they do not accept.
And there was one witness in the Jason Swift case, a witness of perfectly good character, who did provide what could have been the vital clue. What's more, he made a statement to the police before anyone was charged with Jason's death. Richard Stack was with Lennie the night before the discovery of Jason's body was made public.
Lennie was walking me to the bus stop to get my bus home. When we got to about here, Lennie pointed up and said, "That's where Jason Swift lived," and then pointed below and said, "That's where he was murdered." And the next day it was in the paper and on the local news. And then I contacted the police, but it made me really scared, and I couldn't understand why Lennie had said that the night before.
And this was before it was common knowledge, before it was in the papers?
Yeah, before.
And he was saying that's where Jason was killed, that's where he was murdered.
After Smith's gang were convicted, new evidence began to emerge linking Lennie to the death of another child. Gang member Leslie Bailey was serving 15 years for his part in the manslaughter of Jason Swift. And he told his cellmate about an earlier orgy where Lennie Smith, he said, killed Mark Tildesley, who was just 7 years old. According to Bailey, Sidney Cooke had picked the boy up at a Wokingham fairground. Cooke telephoned Lennie Smith with the news of his prize. Smith asked Bailey to drive him down to Wokingham. The men met up and took the boy to a caravan. That night, Mark Tildesley was repeatedly raped and then killed. Bailey's cellmate took notes and handed them to the police. Leslie Bailey is now dead, but these are the actual extracts of tape recordings of his interviews with the police.
Les, you hear, okay? We're talking about pretty horrendous things here. You must tell us the truth, exactly what happened, okay? The others are starting to get dressed, and you can't see any movement in the boy. You said he didn't appear to be breathing. Can you tell me what happened then?
I said to Lennie, "What have you done?" Yeah?
You said to Lennie, "What have you done?"
Yeah.
Why did you say that to Lennie?
Because he was the last one before me.
Lennie was the last one before you to bugger the boy. Carry on.
And Lennie said he was asleep. I said, "He ain't."
Lennie said he was asleep?
Yeah.
Carry on.
I told him he wasn't.
Carry on.
I said, "The boy's dead."
Bailey was later murdered in prison, so his evidence can no longer be tested in court. But at the time he gave it, was Bailey telling the truth? And was there enough evidence to charge Smith? The police brought in a specialist in the treatment of criminal paedophiles.
The information on the tapes by Bailey was very much having Lennie Smith as a ringleader, as very central to the murder of the children. And although they're all engaging in the sexual acts and the sexual abuse, issues around asphyxiation and strangulation, they are pointing the finger at Lennie Smith as being the person who did that.
You said that Lennie started squeezing. Can you describe to me how? You're indicating again with his hand around the front of his neck and windpipe and squeezing together. What was the boy's reaction to this?
Changing colour, I was going pure white.
The boy was going pure white.
The body of Mark Tildesley was never found. In spite of statements from witnesses and other evidence, the Crown Prosecution Service only prosecuted Leslie Bailey. To the bewilderment of the police officer in charge of the case, Lennie Smith was not charged with the killing.
It's not the role, in my view, of the Crown Prosecution Service to conduct trials in their office. But any case that has sufficient evidence should be taken to a court. It's the function of the jury to decide, not 3 or 4 people in an office somewhere in the middle of London.
The Crown Prosecution Service has told dispatches that it recognises there are occasions when the police will be disappointed with their decisions. But ultimately they have to review the evidence independently and consider carefully whether it can be used in court and is reliable. And in Lennie Smith's case, they decided the evidence was insufficient.
They were willing to accept the evidence of Bailey, which led him to being given a life sentence, and yet the same man who was talking about the other men, they were not even willing to allow it to go to court for a jury to decide. I am not today saying that he was guilty. What I am saying is that a jury should have been allowed to have decided that if they had listened to what I had listened to, I believe they would have seen that this case should have come to court.
The information on the Bailey confession tapes implicated Sidney Cooke in the killing of Mark Tildesley, but the CPS didn't prosecute Cooke either. Sidney Cooke, seen here receiving a prison prize for making children's toys, completed his sentence and was released from prison in April last year. Soon after, dispatches launched its own investigation into Cooke's case.
The police are following up the 2 new cases of assault dispatches have uncovered.
As a result of the programme broadcast last October, 500 people contacted us. The very last call led the police to uncover new victims of Sidney Cooke. Earlier this month, Cooke pleaded guilty to 5 counts of indecent assault and 5 counts of buggery on 2 children. He is in custody, awaiting sentence. And Lennie Smith? Over a 15-year period, Smith has been convicted 5 times for sex offences. When Lennie Smith does eventually decide to re-enter society, he'll have to register with the police. But this master of disguise could vanish without trace. And now he's even more dangerous. Smith has been diagnosed HIV positive. And has his appetite faded since he spoke to Derek during a previous spell in prison?
Well, he said to me, he said the first time I get out of prison, he says, I'm lining myself up with a lovely little chicken. That's the exact words he said to me. And I said, well, what are you going to do then, Lennie? He said, well, you know what I'm going to do. He said, I shall abuse him. I said, but yeah, Lennie, but are they going to put you back inside? How? He said, well, he said, I shall cover my tracks this time.
There's a yet more astonishing twist to the story. The word from behind the wire is that Lennie Smith wants to start a new life with a new gender. He wants a sex change operation so that he can once more become a part of society, only this time as a woman. So can Britain's most dangerous sex offender be made safe by surgery?
cutting the penis off, reducing some of the sexual arousal without looking at the sadistic side, the anger side, the revenge side, I think would be highly dangerous. Because if I still have the thinking to want to do it, and I no longer can carry out that, won't that feed into even more problems in relationship to sadism and to expressions of anger and into the dangerousness of this man?
He likes little boys too much. So I don't think he would ever go through with that. That's just to make people think that is turning the corner. But it's not really. It's only for his own benefit. It's only for his own use.
Dispatches has reason to believe there may be other victims of Lennie Smith who the police have yet to find. If you're a victim of Smith, or if you have any information about him, and if you feel perhaps that for too long justice has not been done, then please call the number you'll shortly see appearing on your screen. Any information will be treated in confidence.
They've really got to come forward. You can't tell me that there's no other kids out there. There is. I mean, Nicky was 6, he's 21. There could be other kids there. It could be 7, 8, 9, and they could be in their late 20s, 30s. They could be married and got kids of their own. Don't bottle it up. Don't bottle it up. You've got to talk to someone and come forward. Don't do what my Nick done. Because it's not going to help them. It's not going to help them.